Hello, I'm Jim Cornell, and this is Base to Base, the weekly biotech podcast from Air Coastal Media. Yes, welcome again to the Base to Base Biotech podcast, and this is number 66, and it's going live on July the 3rd, sandwiched between Canada Day and the 4th. Probably shouldn't have said sandwich, now I'm hungry. Last week, our guest was Jonathan Cohen Gold, CEO and co-founder of a newly launched company, Houdini Bio. This week, we're chatting with Jeff Fischer, president of Longhorn Vaccines and Diagnostics, and with Hannah Ames, founder and CEO of Luvida. If you do have news or suggestions for who should be on the podcast, or indeed any other suggestions or comments, please do get in touch at jim@deeptechdigest.com, which is also the address you can use if you're interested in advertising with us or sponsoring a podcast episode or for event coverage. First, it's time to go through some of the headlines of the articles you may have missed over at deeptechdigest.com in the past week. Brain tau spreads differently in early and late onset Alzheimer's disease. Biogen has boosted its immunology pipeline through a $1 billion acquisition of Raythera. And BioArctic and Lilly have signed a research agreement. New research could lead to a vaccine for severe diarrhea. A mechanism has been found for weakening one of the bacteria responsible for food poisoning, and the first clinical evidence of increased lean muscle volume in FSHD patients after treatment has been announced. A new drug for chronic heart failure has been tested in an early study. Roche has launched a new sequencing platform, and abnormally long mitochondria leak RNA to activate anti-tumor immunity. There is an enzyme that evolves into a control switch to reveal a new tuberculosis weak spot. Fast Track designation has been given for an epidermolysis bullosa simplex treatment, and you can read all of these and plenty more at deeptechdigest.com. All right, let's get to this week's interviews, and first we're headed to Maryland and Longhorn Vaccines and Diagnostics. It's a biopharma company developing vaccines, monoclonal antibodies, and diagnostics targeting pathogens. With us today is Jeff Fischer, president of the company. Hi Jeff, thanks for being with us today. First, maybe you could give us a bit of background on the company.
This is the second biotech company I've been part of starting, and I was very fortunate. My father is a pediatric infectious disease specialist and got forced into the biotech industry when he and a couple of his colleagues discovered that antibodies to respiratory syncytial virus could be protective, which was not something that it was actually considered the opposite, that some people felt if you put antibodies on in the face of RSV, that you might make the infections worse. And so he was in the Army at the time, got pushed out to start a company with his colleagues. And that led to really the first product for RSV, which for 20 years was the only product for RSV to help premature babies get through their first season of life without getting re-hospitalized. He invited me to come back and help him spin out a new company after I got out of business school, which was at the University of Texas. And we started that company, and we developed a monoclonal antibody to prevent staphylococcal infections in premature babies. We took that product through phase 2, and then our investors decided they wanted us to sell the company. We sold the company. It went under new management, went under new ownership, and unfortunately, the product did not succeed in phase 3. So when we sold that company, we started a new company, and that's where Longhorn came in. And so we were looking at ways to affect what we saw as a potential coming influenza pandemic. And so we focused on two real key areas. We wanted to find a universal influenza vaccine so that we could prevent an influenza pandemic. And then we also wanted to find better ways of testing for influenza, especially out towards the source of where we thought that pandemic might come from. And at the time, H5N1 influenza A was circulating in Asia, mostly in China. And so the feeling was that we needed to be able to have something that could go into those more challenging climates and be able to collect samples and be able to test samples without needing an extensive cold chain. And so on the diagnostic side, we really focused on molecular diagnostics, and then the real focus came down onto a better way to collect a sample for that testing. And so why Longhorn? The molecular diagnostic lab that we set up was in Texas because the person that we wanted to run that lab was in Texas. And so my background at the University of Texas and our presence in Texas, thought Longhorn seemed like a really good name for that. It's been great because it's such a well-known name and so associated, obviously, with the university. Whenever we would go to conferences anywhere in the world, people would stop by the booth and say, "Oh, wait, I went to Texas A&M, or I went to Oklahoma, or I lived in Houston," and so it really was a great way to draw people in, and people really like the logo. It's we got a little helix, double helix for horns.
So, what are the focus areas for the company?
So we have a commercial diagnostic group. We have a product called PrimeStore Molecular Transport Media, which is a predicate device for nucleic acid stabilization and transport. And so we took that product through the FDA in 2018. We created a brand new category of device. It was, again, originally set up for influenza, and we had also had an indication for tuberculosis. But when the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic hit, it was the ideal sample collection and transport device. And so it became a very successful commercialization. And since the end of the pandemic, it's expanded across many, many different sample collection types, as well as many different pathogens. And so it's growing, and we've got some really exciting news. Unfortunately, I can't talk about yet. We're expecting in Q4 from that product, and I think it will be further industry changing in the way that when we first brought out the product, it was industry changing. So that's on our diagnostic side. And then we have a vaccine and antibody development side. We have that universal influenza vaccine that is in the IND-enabling stage. We're very excited about it. We think it's the most comprehensive universal influenza vaccine ever developed. Instead of going after a single target or multiple variations of a single target, we go after three main components of the influenza virus and how it replicates. We go after the hemagglutinin, which is how it binds to the cell. We go after the matrix, which is how it replicates in the cell. And then we go after the neuraminidase, which is how it exits the cell. And so we feel in that sense, it's really the most broad-based vaccine. And so we were just about to go in the clinic, and what we realized is, from a resource standpoint, there was a better opportunity, and that's the direction which we're going with our monoclonal antibodies for bacterial infections and inflammatory disease. So we're very excited about all these components, and we're doing all this with a team of about 15 people, half of them on the diagnostic side and half of them on the vaccine and antibody side.
Because you were talking about influenza and the pandemic, are you confident that if there's another pandemic, whatever it is, that it's going to be something that we can tackle head on like we were able to with COVID?
I think we'll be faster in our response, especially the side that I worked the most on, which was the testing side. I think that the capabilities on the testing side have expanded. I think that the ability to develop new assays faster and more effectively, the ability to run the logistics, I think is going to be better this time. A lot of the things that we benefited from in the first 6 months of the pandemic, lack of supplies and lack of components, I think we've done a better job of preparing for. So I think in that sense, I think we'll be in a better situation. I think the biggest challenge will be, I don't think a lot of the techniques that were used will be as effective in the way of controlling movements and controlling other components, because I think people will be a little more skeptical. I think it'll likely depend on whether the strain is much more deadly or much higher morbidity. I think that would be the key effect to it.
Do you think that with things like antimicrobial resistance, inflammatory disease, sepsis, that because they aren't expensive treatments like cell and gene therapies, that there hasn't been the investigation or investment in those?
I think there's a lot of investigation because there's a lot of need. I think that it's fragmented. I think that it's going after individual components as opposed to looking at it more holistically, which is I think one of the benefits of our approach is that we're able to look at bacterial infections, we're looking at AMR, and we're looking at inflammatory disease all under the same umbrella, which is the role that the bacteria itself plays, and potentially looking at ways to how do you go after the core components of that are universal across bacteria, and as well as the toxins and immune modulators that they produce. And so we've found some very common ones that we think play a role in everything from the AMR to the infections themselves to the immune response, which causes sepsis, and then maybe even the role that bacteria play in everyday chronic low level inflammation. Because it's not surprising that if you have 1 trillion bacteria in your body and they're releasing these inflammatory components, that when these things get outside of where they're supposed to be, that they cause problems. And as we change our diet, as we change our habits, as we become sicker in many ways, these bacteria and their components get out of the gut, they get through the skin, they get out of the oral cavity, and they get into places they're not supposed to be. And the body reacts, and the more often it happens, the more the body's always reacting. And this is the approach that we're taking, is the ability to bring down that response, to modulate that immune response without making the host immune suppressed.
As you were mentioning that, I was thinking about climate change. Does that have an effect? Because clearly the human body is more stressed by heat, and there's obviously more heat waves and more extreme weather than we've ever had.
I think it's certainly one of the areas that probably affects it. I think that it certainly could affect things about the type of food we eat, the type of food we can grow, the diet that it causes. Really, as you said, though, any stress is going to cause more leaking from the gut. And as that leaking occurs, it's going to further inflame the body, even at a low level. And again, it slowly damages organs. And it really is the body almost fighting itself while it's constantly trying to fight an infection that's not there.
So, what's the company's approach been to things like early detection and disease monitoring?
So we work with the largest infectious disease molecular lab in the country. They use our product exclusively for collecting their samples, shipping them overnight to their facility in Louisville, Kentucky. They work very closely with UPS. So every time a UPS plane lands in Louisville, it offloads samples for testing. It allows them to test all over the country really in less than 12 hours. The sample's taken, delivered, and they receive the results the next morning. So for our ability, we don't get involved in the testing. We make the testing easier. We make it more efficient. We make it more sensitive. And that allows labs like our customers to do more and to give the customer faster, better results. That's going to allow doctors and other health practitioners to make better decisions and to put the right drugs on at the right time. And in many cases, the faster you can put on a drug, the more effective it's going to be.
I was really interested in something on your website that mentions the company having a track record of some of the biggest breakthroughs in molecular testing. I wonder if you could elaborate on that a little bit.
Well, one of the challenges is getting good samples back in challenging situations, and especially when you're looking to try and find things that are difficult to find. And I think one of those areas that we've seen that is working on better ways of detecting tuberculosis. We've been working in the last 15 years on this, and when we started, the only way to detect tuberculosis, active infection, was by sputum. And a lot of patients can't produce very much sputum. If they have a low amount of TB in the sample, it's hard to find. In children, they don't produce sputum. And so you have to do very invasive testing where you have to put a tube down and take out gastric aspirates in the morning. It's very painful. And so the technology we have that stabilizes and fully lyses pathogens, well, it stabilizes the nucleic acid and fully lyses the pathogens, allows every one of those mycobacterium to be lysed and all that DNA to be released. And techniques like tongue swabbing or rectal swabbing in children is producing very good results without being so invasive and making compliance just a lot easier for patients.
I wonder if you could turn to some of the products that you have and the things that you do. Could you tell me about Prime Store MTM?
So this is a chemically based sample collection media. It fully inactivates the sample, so it lyses all of the pathogens. So this creates a couple of really positive issues for sample collection and testing. First and foremost, it makes the sample safe. So in a situation like a pandemic, or in a situation where over in Africa right now where we have Ebola circulating, the ability to put the sample in, have it fully lysed, and now be able to handle it without worry about somebody along the way being contaminated or that laboratory worker potentially being infected when they are handling that sample is a very significant component. But also by lysing all of the enzymes and all of the other components of the sample, you get much less degradation of the nucleic acid. And so now you can move it at ambient temperature, even high ambient temperatures over days, weeks, or months, and you don't get that degradation. So it gives you a lot more ability to deal with challenging samples and get them to a facility where they can be tested. And one of the benefits that we've accrued to our largest client is instead of having to pack every sample as a biohazard and with some sort of cold packs, they're able to just put them into a standard envelope. And so from a standpoint of UPS shipping, it just becomes more efficient and more effective and more cost effective because they don't have to add that extra weight or that extra size.
And what's LHNVD 501 and how does that work?
So LHNVD 501 is our extended half-life anti-peptidoglycan antibody. So peptidoglycan is a part of the cell wall of pretty much all bacteria, including mycobacteria. And it plays a significant role in holding that bacteria together. And it's also shed as part of either the cell death or even the cell wall rebuilding itself. And when it does that, it turns on the immune system. And so this antibody does two things. Well, it actually does three. It binds that bacteria and recruits the immune system to clear that bacteria. It also binds the free peptidoglycan circulating. And now that is also reducing the inflammation and the immune response to those components, which is helping to reduce the infection while at the same time keeping the body from over-responding to that infection.
And what about LHNVD 502?
So 502 is actually that antibody we talked about in the very beginning, the one that we had in the previous company. So that antibody, which showed great success through phase 2, one of its limitations was that it had a short half-life, especially in premature babies. And so what we've now done is taken that antibody, gone back to its mouse roots, and we've rehumanized it and used a modification called YTE to extend its half-life. And so that antibody now does all the same things it used to do, but now has a much longer half-life, which allows the dosing to be much easier to manage. And that was one of the challenges that we saw in phase 2 and that they definitely saw in phase 3 was how to provide enough antibody without overloading the antibody. And that was probably the main thing that kept that product from being successful, almost 20 years ago. And so now we've brought that back forward and look to combine that with the anti-peptidoglycan antibody. And that 502 targets a component on gram-positive bacteria called lactobacillic acid, which again allows the antibody to bind The bacteria allows it to recruit the immune system to clear the bacteria, but lactobacillic acid also turns on the immune system, and therefore it's another way to, again, modulate that immune response and make sure that you don't get into that septic state.
Do you have other things in the pipeline?
The other one is that universal influenza vaccine, which there's becoming more and more interest again in looking at universal influenza vaccines. And we hope that we can find government funding partners and others that want to move that forward because we believe very strongly in it.
Could you tell me a bit more about some of the research that you're doing and where some of these assets currently sit?
All of these assets are really in the IND-enabling stage. And so we're looking now at expanding some of the research on how these antibodies might work together, looking at how these antibodies might impact diseases beyond infectious diseases, looking at everything from metabolic disease to different inflammatory diseases, autoimmune diseases, and even ultimately neurodegenerative diseases, because peptidoglycan is something that has been shown to move all the way up and accumulate in the brain. So we know it's there, and if it's there and we know it causes inflammation, then we think that it likely has an impact. It probably explains why, as we get older, a lot of these things get worse, because a lot of this leakage from different compartments gets worse as we get older.
So, where do you see the results of that research that you're doing ending up, I guess, ultimately for patients?
Well, the exciting thing is there's a great demand for anti-infectives, especially in the hospital setting. They're really preventing sepsis, preventing bacterial infections in the hospital is crucial and an unmet need. And we think that the fastest way to market is to bring these products through that process. And then once on the market, we can really look at expanding into these other inflammatory and metabolic disease areas. And we see that, what seemingly is an anti-infective product may have much, much broader implications.
Do you see that a lot of what you're doing has broader implications other than what you're using them for now?
I think the more we study it, the more we look at how the body works, and I think it makes more sense. Pharmaceutical companies have spent a lot of time looking at individual cytokines, individual immune markers that they can turn off, but they really haven't gone upstream to the level of what is turning all of this on. And we think that maybe this is an umbrella product that can play a significant role in reducing the components that turn on these unintended inflammatory situations. Ultimately, we've seen that there's definitely interest in moving upstream, but to this point, they're still looking at things to turn off, not ways to prevent them from being turned on. And we think that's the ultimate paradigm shift, is instead of turning off what shouldn't be turned on, make sure it never gets turned on.
How's that message being received? Is that something that you're taking that message out and it's being listened to? Or?
I think people like it, but I don't think that they believe it fully yet. I think that it's one of those situations where it has to be proved. Once it's proved, then I think there'll be a rush into that area. We think that if we're successful, we'll be the first there and be way ahead. So it's just a matter of getting there and finding people who are willing to take that risk with us.
Is that partnerships or funding or both?
It's a combination. There's definitely a lot of groups keeping an eye on it. I think the biggest challenge is getting over that hurdle. Fortunately, we have a commercial side of our diagnostic division that's able to help fund some of this. We're actually talking to funding partners now about adding more. The US government has shown interest, especially in the approach on bacterial infections. And so that will help us, I think, to get further along. And then I think it'll just have to play out with true clinical trials and see how, if it does what we see and what we have seen in the past in humans, I think that it will accelerate significantly. And unfortunately, at that point is when everybody will come in, not when you need them to help you get started, but once you've started proving it, then everybody will want to be a part of it. But we'll find the right people, and I'm not concerned that we'll get this out there. Again, hopefully can impact a lot of lives and go back to where we started, which was getting a product on the market that nobody expected and helping lots of people.
Really impressive work, and I'm looking forward to catching up with them again at the end of the year for their next major announcement. Next, it's clinical trials, central to the entire industry. But are they as efficient as they could be? Today we're looking at clinical trial bottlenecks with a relatively new company, Luvida, and finding out how they approach things differently. The CEO and co-founder is Hannah Amies. Hi Hannah, thanks for joining us. Looking forward to learning more about what you do. Wonder if you could first tell us a little bit about Luvida.
So Luvida is an AI-driven data platform. We're transforming how clinical trials are designed, really by bringing in overlooked patient information for the first time. I suppose to take a step back, and I think all your listeners will probably know, the industry's poured billions into generating biomedical and clinical evidence. So things like genomic databases, electronic patient records, biobanks, things like that. But despite that, trial failure rates have actually barely moved over the last kind of 20 years. Around 80% of trials fail to recruit on time. Fewer than 5% of eligible patients ever actually choose to participate in one as well. And that's really what we're solving. So I suppose what I've seen is that clinical trials aren't really failing patients just because of bad science. Often that's not actually the case, but because of this translation failure between the data that exists and the decisions that are being made. We've built Luvida to address that gap. So really enabling trial teams to understand the full patient picture. It might be worth me digging into a little bit about what I really mean by the full patient picture. So our platform contains what we call electronic life records. So these extend beyond that traditional clinical and biomedical data to also include social determinants of health data. So that's things like patient lifestyle, behavior, socioeconomic factors, and they're directly driving recruitment, enrollment, and dropout in trials. So it's really critical information and data that we have about these patients to the trial outcomes. I think another way I like to think about this as well is by bringing together everything that happens not only just inside the clinic, but also outside of the clinic. It's allowing us to uncover these hidden risks that are driving these kind of enrollment, recruitment, and attrition challenges. So the clinical teams can really understand the person behind the patient, so the rest of the stuff that goes on in their life, and then make much more informed design decisions to prevent those downstream challenges.
Is that something that companies maybe sometimes don't even notice?
I would say when I speak to customers, most of them have noticed this and have very anecdotal evidence around this. So I'll be speaking to a customer, they'll talk about a trial that they've previously done, and they'll share their experience and they'll say, yeah, we want to be able to use this. And we try and talk to our sponsor about this for the next trial and tell them what we experienced. But it's a very anecdotal kind of opinion driven process. And we're enabling them to have that conversation, but with data backing those decisions, which supports them a lot as well with their conversations with sponsors.
So, what are some of the biggest challenges with clinical trial planning and design?
Yeah, good question. I suppose, as I mentioned, I don't think we've really moved the needle on trial success in terms of recruitment timelines and dropout. There have been quite a lot of different attempts at this. Obviously, we've spent a lot on biomedical and clinical evidence and that kind of early stage drug discovery part. So we're churning out lots of drugs and targets. But I think there's been quite a dearth of innovation in clinical trials specifically, but that is starting to change. So, like I said, about 80% of trials are failing to recruit on time, but also 95% of eligible patients aren't even enrolling, and that's driving those kind of recruitment challenges as well. Astronomical costs associated with that, time to market is massively delayed. The other piece here as well is that, as I mentioned, those design decisions are often quite opinion driven because that's all people have to go off. And that's leading to subsequent protocol amendments. They cost, depending on the trial, somewhere between 300 and 500K and adding about 3 months to the timeline. I think Tufts recently published a report that the average number of amendments per trial has increased over the last decade to 3.3 amendments per trial. So if you take that as a whole, that's nearly 10 months delay to market, $1.5 million wasted in costs on the trial itself. But also then ultimately it's causing billions in lost on patent revenue, but also preventing these life-saving treatments to reach patients sooner. I can dig into that a bit further as well. I think there's some really key issues. What I see a lot is this quite sequential process from design to feasibility to actually recruiting to running the trial. Teams are being handed protocols that they can't change and they don't get a say in that. So what we're really doing is bringing that feasibility angle and the patient voice into that trial design piece. I think something that we're doing that's quite unique actually is looking at why people aren't enrolling on a trial. So that 95% of eligible patients that aren't enrolling, why are they not enrolling? And I think there's really limited visibility on the reasons for that today. Some people will be running patient focus groups. They might do this on 10, 20 patients if you're lucky. And then they're extrapolating that insight out to the entire population. And then we wonder why things don't go as we're expecting them to. It's because that's quite unreliable and unrealistic. There is a lot of heterogeneity between sites and even geographies. So that patient voice needs to really be brought in at scale. And that's exactly what we're doing.
How do you convince people? Because it's all well and good saying we're going to do a clinical trial, we need X number of people. How do you get the patients involved?
There's quite a few different ways you can do that. So I guess what we're really talking about here is kind of where the data is coming from. So a lot of it is open source. There's a lot of information out there, both in kind of literature research, but also in kind of massive census data sets and things like that, like the CDC data in the US. And we can leverage that. And we've built our own social determinants of health ontologies and proprietary pipelines and things to be able to manage that and handle that. We then tie all of that to the literature and past historic trials. There's about 600K of those available and the issues that have happened on those trials. So it's lots of disparate data and pulling that together. And that's a really big job. We then also supplement a lot of that data. So we've talked about that kind of 95% of patients that walk away. And one of the things that we do, because we know the key risk factors, we also know what missingness there is in that kind of open source data. We can really specifically collect patient level data to supplement these electronic records that we've built out. We tend to do that on specific projects and in collaboration with our partners. And one of the ways that we do that as well is by running surveys on people that decline to participate in a trial to get that insight as to what their motivation and reasoning is for that. That can then be used on that trial to inform the enrollment and recruitment process as it's going on. But also importantly, it creates a really systematic structure for learning for future trials as well.
Getting people into trials in the first place can be challenging. What about retention? Do you have figures on retention of people in trials? Because I guess a lot of people may only do it for a couple of weeks and then drop out.
Yes, I think there's some really valid reasons actually for dropping out or ceasing a trial altogether. And I think that's something that we should pay attention to here as well. So things like adverse events, treatment tolerability, like these core safety issues, really you shouldn't be continuing with a trial in that scenario. But outside of this, I do think there's also lots of reasons for dropout that shouldn't be happening. And these sorts of things I'm thinking about are patient burden in the protocol, socioeconomic constraints, behavior, lifestyle, and motivation. So they're all drivers of trial participation, but also attrition or dropout. And that's what we're really digging into is those socioeconomic behavior, lifestyle factors and how we can improve the protocol to mitigate against those. I've actually got quite an interesting example of this from a recent trial. So this is like a global multi-year trial, and they experience quite significant levels of dropout. That tends to happen a bit more on these longer trials. But one of the reasons for this, which was coming up quite a lot, was participants actually just wanting to go on holiday. And the insurance that they needed was completely unaffordable, or they just couldn't get it in the first place. So they weren't able to go on holiday. And they wanted to prioritize that. That was important in their life. Committing to not going on holiday for multiple years is quite unrealistic. So that started being assessed. It led to a lot of on-trial operational complexity, massive sunk costs, huge productivity loss, and ultimately, in quite a few scenarios, the patients withdrew from that trial. That's something that's actually quite straightforward to resolve. For example, the sponsor can provide a list of insurance providers that will provide cover, but also support reimbursement of the cost of this. And I think it's worth noting that in the grand scheme of what you're spending on one of these types of trials, that's actually not a very large cost. But something we do is model that out for our customers in advance and also surface that that is potentially going to happen as well, so they can mitigate for it before it becomes a problem on the trial itself. So if they'd factored that in from the start, they would have avoided not only those significant operational overheads, but also that patient experience and ultimately the dropout.
So I guess that's one of the positives about using a company like yours is that you can spot these things in advance and help them before they even come to these problems.
Exactly. Like a lot of research is out there and we've systematized a lot of that. And Luvida, like you're saying, like knows these factors and we can surface these based on the eligibility criteria of your protocol, based on the endpoints you're looking at, the duration of the trial. So we can enable our partners to use these from the outset, from trial planning. We look at the social determinants of health profile of that catchment population. So it could be based around a site, it could be on a geography, it could be based on the eligibility criteria, and highlight the risks and burden that are coming out in their protocol. So essentially, our customers get a risk score and a series of mitigations to embed into their design before they've even enrolled the first patient, rather than discovering this empirically once the trial is running.
Are there some diseases or conditions that you have trials for that are more challenging than others?
Yeah, social determinants of health are well evidence drivers for chronic diseases and health outcomes. The way I like to think about trials is they're essentially a proxy for real world health outcomes. So, what we see in the real world is inevitably what happens in a trial. So, having this view of the patient and the person behind that patient and getting that integrated as early as possible doesn't just improve those trial outcomes, but also can provide a lot of critical information on diversity and actually down the line market access. So some of these chronic diseases I'm thinking of are things like diabetes, obesity, chronic kidney disease, cardiovascular, liver disease. They're all ones that we have really strong data and risk factors for. And we've got some others as well, like stroke, depression, arthritis. I would say that ultimately these kind of social determinants of health do impact every indication, though, and trial participation in every trial. So we can support all of that. I suppose what I would say is that with immediately life-threatening indications, so for example, some oncology trials or particularly rare diseases, a lot of the challenge actually tends to be in finding the patients in the first place. And there are some really great tools and companies in the market that specialize in that, like patient finding side of recruitment.
Right, yeah, I was going to ask about that because clearly you're mentioning things like obesity, diabetes, those are on the rise. So I would think that finding people for a trial in that is less challenging than some of those rare diseases. I've interviewed companies where there's maybe a couple of hundred people globally have this condition. I mean, and if you only get a certain percentage of people participating in a trial, then that's a massive setback right away, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. I think something to point out here as well is the thing that we're supporting isn't about being choosy. We're not suggesting you discriminate or exclude people based on some of the profile around what else is going on in their life. So we're supporting, for example, CROs and sponsors to find the most suitable eligibility criteria up front. What are the risks that you might see there, and how can you mitigate against those? In the case of rare disease, when your eligible population is already really small, where I would focus is in the attrition. Every dropout becomes critical. You can't afford to be losing patients that you should have retained. And so this is where you really need to support them on that patient pathway through that clinical trial. So Yeah, I suppose the question isn't about being choosy about who enrolls. It's whether you've done everything possible to design a trial that keeps the patients that you do recruit. And that's where we're adding significant value. So identifying those barriers and burdens, we surface those in that specific population before the trial starts. So you can build those mitigations in from day one.
There are clearly other companies that help drug discovery and help with clinical trials. What is it that you're doing differently that sets you apart?
This isn't something that is done as industry standard at all. So I suppose that feels very different and a very different approach. Like I said, it's been done a bit anecdotally. We've done patient focus groups, things like that. But ultimately, bringing social determinants of health at scale into this part of the trial design and operations process is completely novel. There aren't any other companies that are approaching this in the way that we are. This ad hoc information that's captured isn't scalable, isn't repeatable. So patient focus groups and key opinion leaders, definitely a place for them, but we need to supplement that with this at scale data. It's there, it's ready to be used. It's just been very challenging to use to date, and that's what we're enabling. So on top of that, something that we make sure we do is that everything is evidence first. Like we don't show anything in our platform that cannot be traced back to the source evidence. So whether that's a paper, a trial itself, a protocol, or the population and patient data, we've built this as a decision support tool. We call it expert in the loop. We give our users, these clinical experts, the rationale for different approaches, the risks, and also the precedents there. And ultimately, the user is making that final decision. So I think everyone is aware that trials are super complex. I see that our users have really deep expertise and experience in this space. So I'm personally not a believer that AI is going to replace that in the near future.
How does what you're doing work? Is it like a consultancy basis? Do you talk with them and help them along, or is there a like a software component to this that people use? How does it actually work, I guess?
Yeah, so we've got quite a few different kind of partnerships in place. We deliver slightly different things where is required for our customers. So we've been working with global CROs, actually delivering trials in the US. So they're very much using the tool to assess their RFPs and feasibility and deciding whether to respond to those, whether they think that they can actually support them. Sometimes we'll provide a single report to help them understand the risk in that particular protocol they've been given. But I'm tending to find that more often than not, they actually want access to the full platform. So we've got a UI and that they can go in and iterate and refine their decision making autonomously. On the earlier side of that, we're working with large pharma companies. So we're actually supporting them with their trial design, which they would then take to a CRO. So this tends to sit across clinical development, real world evidence, and ClinOps teams. And we're facilitating that collaboration between the teams. The platform, again, is accessible through a UI, but we also have a few customers that are building their own models. Perhaps they have quite large in-house data science teams, and they're interested in our data and insights to be able to feed their own models. So we serve this through an API. I think something interesting recently is we've opened up the platform to biotech customers too. Personally, I think that's been amazing, just seeing some of the incredible work that we've been able to support here. We've actually enabled one team to reduce their outsourcing consultancy needs by 250K, and that's a lot of money to a biotech company. We enabled them to move from protocol synopsis to a full protocol in weeks, where it would usually take months. And they've been able to secure sites a lot quicker off the back of that because the clinicians can see the rationale behind why certain decisions have been made. Something I'd love to plug here that's really, really exciting. But for anyone interested in actually seeing this for themselves, we do have a limited trial program for our Trial Explorer module. So you can head to the website, apply for access to the product, and go in and play around and run a few simulations for yourself to see how it really works. This has been going down really well, and we've been really delighted with the amount of sign-ups. So feel free to have a play.
And the website is, seen as you were plugging.
www.luvida.co.uk.
Do you see that that is going to be something that will evolve over time because of improvements to AI or the increase in data that you have access to?
Yeah, definitely. We've started showing the value. Well, we started showing the value last year doing retrospective analyses. So that allowed us to prove value really quickly. But we have also more recently evaluated this in real trials. So we started initially with asking, can we predict the eligibility criteria? Can we predict endpoints? Is the AI good enough to see protocol amendments that haven't happened yet? The way we did this, we blinded our models to the actual trial and we time sliced the data to include only the data that would have been available when that trial started. That's just to make it fair. Our models now have a 60 to 100% match on eligibility criteria and endpoint prediction. Obviously, that's quite a large range, and that does vary depending on the indication area, the level of regulatory shift at different moments, and it doesn't account for where there were superfluous eligibility criteria used, i.e., it was too restrictive in the first place. Our models are also predicting nearly 50% of protocol amendments on average, which is really impressive. So, for example, in a type 2 diabetes phase 1 study, through this retrospective analysis, we actually identified the amendment to adjust the age range that actually happened on that trial. So we would have identified that up front, avoided that protocol amendment, avoided the cost and delays associated with that. If they had done that, that would have been nearly 300K, 3 months of time, and not accounting for all of the productivity loss. So you can really see the value coming to life here. More recently, we've moved quite a long way since then. We're now running reports for specific trials. So, a recent project we worked on there, we identified 23 risks. And I should say as well, protective factors. Some of these risks are actually protective in the eligibility criteria and sites selected for a given protocol. We took this a step further as well, and we're able to simulate hundreds of different scenarios. So through a protocol, you can make different tweaks either to the sites you want to select or the eligibility criteria, and we can see the populations around those, and we can help support identify the best protocol design, weighing up all those different factors. One of our most recent customers has been using Luvida to develop a protocol for a stroke rehabilitation program. They've got a really, really cool new telemedicine technology which combines music therapy, spatial computing, and assistive robotics devices. They've done a phase 1. They needed to develop a phase 2. So we supported them to develop a first draft of that phase 2 protocol in days. We're now facilitating the clinicians they've secured to onboard onto the platform. This enables them to really see the rationale, the protocol decision making, collaborate with the operations teams really easily, but also importantly brings them on that journey. So they want to take part in this trial. They're really engaged. It's been amazing not only to see that speed at which they've been able to move by using Luvida, but also just this incredible treatment that they're providing to the patients.
Is the key to ensuring that people stay on a trial and also that you get recruitment? Is that basically what you're doing? It's that initial stage, like getting it right in the first place, basically, as opposed to not having all of those ducks in a row.
Exactly, getting it right from the outset, preventing those protocol amendments, but also making these trials good for the patients that are experiencing them, reducing that patient burden, reducing burden on clinicians as well, making these really streamlined trials, getting to market quicker with treatments that are going to change people's lives.
Are you also collecting data on things like who's going to respond better to treatments or what populations are more likely to do well in a certain trial?
We're not focused so much on the kind of molecular and biomedical aspects of patient response to treatment. I think there's some really great work that's been done in that space. I've seen us make huge leaps in the world of omics data, for example. Much of my work actually at Benevolent AI was focused on this. And I think we're now getting a lot better at a lot of that. We're churning out targets and drugs quicker than we can put them through trials. So that's really why we're focused on addressing this bottleneck in the clinical trials themselves for the patients.
Do you think that sometimes the end patient is a part of the process as opposed to being treated as an individual? I mean, do sometimes companies lose sight of the fact that these are individuals?
Yeah, I do think that happens. I don't think that people are intending for that to happen. I think people generally want to be able to do this. It's just hard to do, and they don't have the right tools to be able to do it well. The best thing anyone can do is bring that patient view in as early as possible. We've actually worked with customers at their target product profile stage, so super early. If you can bring in the patient voice and landscape there, you're absolutely beating most of your competition. Something that comes to mind and that I'm very familiar with, and I'm sure your listeners will be too, is the AstraZeneca 5 Rs framework. So finding the right tissue, the right target, safety, commercial, and then the right patient. We're very much focused on that right patient. So the right person for a trial can mean a lot of different things. Originally, this was intended to be very focused on the biomedical profile of who will respond to treatment, but we're extending that to diversity, to engagement, to motivation, to other lifestyle factors that will impact that person and their ability to take part in that trial. And that's really where we're providing value, is in covering those hidden insights on the patient profile.
Do you also work with things like patient advocate groups and awareness groups?
Yeah, so we have a network of data partners that we specifically leverage for specific indications and access to patients. We've set that up. We've got access to that. We will then work with them. They have existing data. We also work with them to supplement that existing data where we know there are risks to that population or to that trial based on that population. And we can then go out and supplement that with surveys or different models depending on how those data partners work. But that is definitely one of the ways that we do this, as well as kind of our own proprietary data collection that we run both on trials and outside of trials.
You mentioned proprietary data, which is always great because then you can use it. Is data access an issue or has it the potential to be an issue?
That's definitely something that's happening in the industry, is proprietary data within these kind of large pharmaceutical companies and others. Obviously, that is proprietary data and that can give a market edge. I don't think the danger is in that commoditization itself in terms of the social determinants of health data. It's that that really valuable patient data is remaining siloed, it's under-leveraged, it's inaccessible. A lot of the data we are using is out there, but people don't know how to use it, and then they can't use that to inform their design decisions. So we're really enabling that access layer. I think our competitive advantage as well isn't simply in the data itself, but it's the infrastructure that we've built to be able to curate, link, and make that actionable for the protocol decision making. That takes significant time and effort to build. And really, what we want to see is a world where all trial teams, not just the largest companies or the ones with the biggest data science functions or that have run the most trials, can access that level of intelligence. Like, that's good for the industry and ultimately good for patients. We do also leverage our partners' data, but we never run this through our models. They have very specific environments, and that is kept very safe and secure. So where they want that, we can leverage their own internal proprietary data.
To kind of wrap up, I wonder how you see clinical trials changing or evolving and maybe even your role in pushing that forward.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a really exciting time to be part of clinical trials and the AI shift that's happening. The biggest push that I see in the industry is on trial timelines. Every sponsor wants to reduce their timelines. Every CRO wants to be able to deliver on this. So that's really where I'm seeing the biggest push in the industry. On top of this, there's some regulatory and governmental things happening. So in the UK, for example, they've set a target to get trials set up within 150 days. So that's cutting that average setup time from 250 to 122 days. Because every day that a trial is delayed really is a day a patient waits longer for a treatment that could change or even save their life. In the US, there's some FDA diversity action plans have come out, and these requirements reflect a slightly different but equally urgent patient truth. If the people most affected by a disease aren't in the trial, then the treatment developed might not work for them. So I actually spoke to a physician last time I was in Boston, and I found out from them that social determinants of health data is actually now being mandated to be collected as part of the electronic patient record system. So things like Epic. To me, this is super cool. This is how we get this person behind the patient embedded structurally. But it also just demonstrates the way the industry is moving and how regulators are thinking. So we're really preparing our customers for this shift that we are seeing today. On a more personal note, I can see us getting to a point where we can actually personalize trials to the patient. I think obviously there's critical things in a trial that need to be consistent. So your randomization must be blinded, the drug given obviously must be the same, and the comparator must be consistent. But beyond that, there are different needs required by different patients. Some patients may need support with reimbursement. Some might need you to do home visit. Some might need childcare support. That level of support and intervention and the type of support that we offer to trial participants can be personalized with our product. And that will improve enrollment and also improve costs. So I think there's this huge opportunity for reducing trial timelines and costs. I think the industry is massively overspending on this today. We're losing billions in on-patent revenue. I think AI is a huge initiative in nearly every company, but some are a bit slower at embracing this than others. There's a lot of work happening in-house, but sometimes these efforts can be slower. They're maybe not built alongside the users, require heavy maintenance as well. So companies that are real innovators that I'm seeing are the ones that are running pilot programs, multiple pilot programs with many vendors to actually determine the real value impact of the tooling. The best way that you can determine value is to pressure test the technology at real world trials. I think they're the companies that will win, the ones that test this technology and adopt it, the open-minded ones, the ones that are willing to change. I think AI is already enabling speed and cost reduction and increasing trial success. And the companies and people that will win are the ones that embrace it. The thing that AI is really good at, and what we're addressing with it, is this huge multivariate problem. When you're designing a trial, there's thousands of different options across the protocol design, whether that's your eligibility or your endpoint criteria or your schedule of activities. And actually, that's what AI is really good at, is bringing together all of those dots to find patterns. Yeah, we're able to then simulate these trials, run all these different variations, and identify what the best opportunities are. Another thing that's really interesting about AI is it can see patterns across different trials. So sometimes actually we can detect patterns in an analogous trial that might not be that specific indication area, but we see that that's happening in that indication area with those patients that are experiencing those life circumstances. And that is relevant to a trial in a different indication area. And so that's what we use our tooling for. But that is also why we surface the insights to the clinical experts to make a final decision, because that's where their expertise and insight really comes into play. So we're just making that process a lot easier. I think the other thing that I get asked a lot by customers is this all just a big LLM? The answer is no. We need to use a real range of different AI techniques. My co-founder, our CTO, James Malone, he's a data scientist by background, did a PhD in bioinformatics and machine learning. But some of those techniques that he used then and that we were using 20 years ago are still highly valuable today. Things like logistic regression, Bayesian, NLP, we basically take the approach of using the right AI method for the job.
For the company, what are you looking forward to for the company in the next, I don't know, year, 2 years?
Ultimately, I'm really excited about what this really means for patients and how it helps them. I think this is totally transformational. I think patients will finally be able to be heard. Their needs can be accounted for in trials, and we'll be serving them with respect and the right support through their journey, through that trial. But more than anything, being able to deliver these life-saving treatments faster than ever, that's what motivates me. That's what gets me out of bed in the morning. That's why I'm doing this. And it extends actually beyond that patient to their family, carers, the clinicians involved in that patient's life as well. The way that we see things at Luvida is that when the patient wins, actually, we all win.
It's going to be really interesting to follow the company as they take on those clinical trial challenges head on. And as Hannah said, it's all about the patients, and that's good news for everyone. So that's it for this week's podcast. If you do want to get in touch with guest opportunities, or if you want to advertise, please feel free to contact us at jim@deeptechdigest.com. And just our usual monthly reminder that there is no charge to be on the podcast. So until next time, wherever in the world you are, I hope you have a great week ahead. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll join us again next time for another Base to Base Biotech podcast. The Base to Base Biotech podcast is an Air Coastal Media Limited production.